Okay, so I'm here to explain what happens when Moon goes into the fifth house on our birth chart. So what is the fifth house? The fifth house is a house that's originally ruled by Sun and Leo. The fifth house represents sex and children, fame, hobbies, dating, creativity. It also represents like research, and it represents like the study of ancient texts and astrology. So some of the themes associated with the fifth house is very similar to the ninth house because of a concept mainly known, at least to me, in Vedic sidereal astrology as the Bhavam theory, which translates to house technique or house to house theory, where you count 5 places from the fifth and you get the ninth house, and 9 places from the ninth house is the fifth house. So these two houses, they're connected to each other, so they share similar themes. So the fifth house, it represent, like political things and astrology and researching and literature and poetry and just higher learning type things. The third house is a house of education, the fifth house is a house of education, and the ninth house is like the top house for education and college and all that crap. So like I said, the third house would be like public education from like elementary to high school, and the fifth house would be like an associate's or bachelor's degree in college. And the ninth house would be getting your PhD, getting your master's, your doctorate, or whatever. So, what is the moon? The moon is the mind, the moon is the emotions, the moon represents the mother. The moon, it represents the way we just react and feel to things. So what else? That is what the moon is. So when you put the moon in the fifth house, you see a lot of things. At least I can stretch out quite a few things here with moon in the fifth house. One thing that we see with moon in the fifth house is that someone could be really interested in, learning and researching and poetry and stuff, but the type of things that the person with the moon in the fifth house would want to learn would greatly depend on the sign that the fifth house is in. What sign is the moon in the fifth house, and what is conjunct the moon, and what's aspecting the moon? Where is the fifth house lord? So those little things will paint the picture of what the person with moon in the fifth house would be interested in wanting to learn. So wherever that is, that could be an area where moon in the fifth would tend to be interested in wanting to learn. Someone with moon in the fifth house, they could really love children. Moon is the emotions and the mind. Fifth house is children. So someone with moon in the fifth house, they could really have a love for children and just be really attached to them. When they have their kids, they'll really identify with their kids. They'll really will bond with their kids. Another thing that we see with moon in the fifth house is that you might be really emotionally attracted to your sex partners. The fifth house is dating, because dating is fun, and children have fun and are free and creative, and a product of, one thing that comes out of dating is sex, and one thing that comes out of sex is children. So that's why all these themes are connected with the fifth house. But with the moon being the mind and the emotions, you might be very attached to your sexual partners. You might really catch feelings, even if it's supposed to be a fling. But that greatly depends on the sign that moon is in, because moon is like a blank canvas. Moon really behaves like the sign that is in. Other than that, moon is pretty neutral. Moon it's just a copycat. It behaves based upon whatever sign it is in. So I can't really specify too hard how moon will behave, especially here in the fifth house. But one of the things that you might see is that someone with moon in the fifth house, they might really be emotionally attached and be connected to their sexual partners and can probably get really hurt. Another thing that you see with moon in the fifth house is that they can possibly be very sexual with moon in the fifth house. Why? Because moon is a fast, astrological body. Moon stays in a sign for 2.5 days. And mythologically, at least in like Vedic Hindu, astrology, moon is known by like two names, Chandra and or Soma. And mythologically, moon is just very sexual. Moon is moon is a man, at least mythologically in Vedic Hindu astrology. Moon is a man, and all I know is that he just had many sexual encounters. He was sort of like a player or whatever. So we can see here with moon in the fifth house, it's very possible for someone to be very sexual and have many sexual encounters. And whether they just be this crybaby person who gets really attached to their partner, or just be someone who's very cold and sneaky and conniving in their little sexual encounters or whatever, would really depend on what's aspect in the moon and what sign the moon is in. What can I say? I said that the fifth house represents fame. That is what's stated for the most part in astrological texts, but really the fifth house is your skills. The fifth house is your talents. And you don't really get famous with your talents until bring them to the 10th house, or you bring them to the 11th, since that's the opposite of the fifth. The opposite of the fifth house is the 11th house, where you're sharing your talents with the whole world and networking with them. But I basically just nailed what happens when moon goes into the fifth house. So just a quick recap, just to make sure that I got everything together up here. Like I said, moon in the fifth house, you can be very attached to your children, or just attached to children in general. Moon in fifth house, you can have a very great love or skills in poetry and artistic talents and dancing, or for researching astrology, or just studying philosophical and spiritual type things. But that greatly depends on what sign the moon is in and what's aspecting the moon and the lord of the fifth house. You could possibly be very attached to your sexual partners, but that also greatly depends on the sign that the moon is in. Someone with moon in the fifth house, they could likely just generally want to have a lot of fun, because the fifth house is a house of fun. It's hobbies. It represents children. Children are free. Children have fun. The moon is a very fast-paced astrological body. Stays in a sign for 2.5 days. It represents our mind, and our mind is very active most of the time and very fast-paced. So someone with moon in the fifth house, they want to be entertained. They want to have or need to have their attention held, and they want to have fun, and they want to be entertained, and they can be very sexual, have a lot of sexual encounters, but they could sort of be scattered mind. They want to have fun, and their mind might become very focused once they direct their attention towards whatever their skills and hobbies are, whatever they want to learn, based upon what sign the moon is in when it goes into the fifth house. Possibly, since the moon represents mother, you possibly maybe had a great childhood with your mom. Possibly, she might have been a source of fun or whatever, but like I said, that greatly depends on the sign and the aspects of the moon in the fifth. But that's basically all I have for you when it comes to moon in the fifth house. Hope this gave you some insight and clarity on what happens when moon goes into the fifth house in your birth chart, and thank you for watching.